She scrubbed the blood from her dress on a train headed nowhere, cigarette burn scars hidden beneath her sleeves. A mail-order bride running from a monster in Boston. But when the cowboy who would become her husband accidentally saw those scars, his voice went dangerously quiet, cold. Not with disgust, with a promise. What she did not know was that the man who tortured her had killed before, and he had killed someone very close to her cowboy. This is a story of two broken people who found each other in the Montana wilderness, of secrets that connected them in ways neither could imagine, and of a reckoning 3 years in the making. Stay until the end. The twist will change everything you think you know. This story reminds us that healing does not mean forgetting. It means finding someone who sees your scars and chooses to stay. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is not run anymore. Sometimes home is not a place. It is a person who makes you feel safe enough to stop hiding. If this story touched your heart, do me a small favor. Hit that like button so more people can find stories that matter. Drop a comment and tell me which moment hit you the hardest. Was it when he saw her scars? Or when she discovered the truth about who Edmund really was? Share this with someone who needs to hear that second chances are real. And if you have not subscribed yet, join our family. We bring you stories every week that will make you feel something real. Now settle in. This journey to Bitter Creek is about to begin. The blood would not come out. Clara Whitmore scrubbed at the hem of her dress in the train wash basin, watching the water turn pink in the dim lamplight. Her hands trembled so badly she could barely grip the fabric. The bruises on her neck throbbed with each beat of her heart, finger-shaped marks that told a story she never wanted to tell. She looked up at the grimy mirror bolted to the wall. A stranger stared back, hair chopped short with kitchen shears, hollow eyes, skin pale as milk. She barely recognized herself. 3 weeks. 3 weeks since she had finally found the courage to run. The train lurched, and Clara grabbed the basin edge to steady herself. Outside the tiny washroom, the Montana blizzard screamed against the windows like something alive and hungry. Snow fell so thick she could not see the world beyond the glass. It was as if everything she had known had simply vanished into white. Good. Let it vanish. Let Edmund Cole and his fine Boston house and his expensive cigars all disappear into the storm. Let the memory of his hands around her throat fade like smoke. She wrung out the dress hem one final time. The stain had faded, but not vanished entirely. A ghost of red remained, like the ghost of everything else. Clara opened the washroom door and made her way back to her seat. The passenger car was half empty. A group of miners played cards in the back, their rough voices carrying through the rattling car. A tired-looking woman dozed against the window, her painted face marking her profession. A preacher sat clutching his Bible, lips moving in silent prayer. Clara chose a seat far from all of them. She pulled her stolen coat tighter around her shoulders. The coat was too large, clearly made for a man. But it was thick and warm, and that was all that mattered. She was cold. She was tired. She was terrified. But she was alive. The conductor had announced their stop would be Bitter Creek, Montana territory. A place Clara had never heard of until 3 weeks ago, when she had spotted the advertisement in a discarded newspaper. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the crumpled clipping. The words were smudged now from being read so many times, but she had them memorized. Rancher seeks wife. Hard life, honest work. No questions about past. That last line, no questions about past. Those 4 words had given her hope, when hope seemed impossible. They had given her a destination when she had none. They had given her a reason to climb onto this train and leave behind everything she had ever known. A man named McAllister had placed the advertisement. She had written to him using a false name, Clara Whitmore, her maiden name before her mother had remarried and given her to Edmund Cole like a piece of furniture. She did not know what kind of man this McAllister was. She did not know if he would be kind or cruel. She did not know if she was trading one prison for another. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She could not stay in Boston. Across the aisle, one of the miners struck a match and lit a cigarette. Clara watched the flame flare orange in the dim car. She watched the tip of the cigarette glow red as the man inhaled. Her entire body went rigid. She could not look away from that glowing ember. In her mind, she heard Edmund's voice, calm and conversational, the way he always sounded right before he taught her a lesson. Pain teaches obedience, Clara. You will learn. The cigarette tip flared brighter as the miner took another drag. Clara's arms burned beneath her sleeves. Phantom pain from wounds that had never fully healed. She forced herself to turn away. She forced herself to breathe, in and out, in and out. The miner was just a stranger smoking a cigarette. He was not Edmund. This was not Boston. She was hundreds of miles away and getting farther with every turn of the train wheels. But her hands still shook for long minutes afterward. The train suddenly lurched to a stop. Clara grabbed her seat to keep from falling forward. Outside the windows, the blizzard howled with renewed fury. The conductor appeared at the front of the car, snow crusted on his uniform. His face was grim. Tracks are blocked ahead, folks. Snow drifts higher than a man. We cannot get through until the storm passes and a crew clears the line. Murmurs of discontent rippled through the passengers. One of the miners swore loudly. How long? The preacher called out. Could be 3 days, maybe more. The conductor held up his hands against the growing complaints. There is food and water enough. We will keep the stoves burning. Nothing to do but wait. Clara's stomach dropped. 3 days. 3 days sitting still in one place. 3 days for Edmund's men to catch up. 3 days for her trail to go cold or her luck to run out. She could not wait 3 days. The conductor had said Bitter Creek was their destination. How far could it be? She stood and pushed her way toward the front of the car where the conductor was fielding questions from angry passengers. How far to Bitter Creek? She asked. The conductor looked at her with tired eyes. 5 miles, miss. But you cannot walk it in this storm. You would freeze before you made it halfway. I understand. She did not sit back down. She stood at the window and stared out at the swirling white, her mind racing through options. Each one seemed worse than the last. Then a man stood up. He had been sitting in the shadows at the back of the car, so still and quiet Clara had not noticed him. Now he rose to his full height, and she realized he was tall, very tall, broad-shouldered beneath a bearskin coat that had seen hard use. His face was weathered and rough, half hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. When he spoke, his voice was deep and calm, the kind of voice that expected to be listened to. I have horses tied at the supply station about a mile east. Anyone wanting to get to Bitter Creek can follow me. The passengers exchanged uncertain glances. The miners shook their heads, clearly preferring the warmth of the train to a trek through the blizzard. Clara did not hesitate. I will go with you. The tall man looked at her. His eyes were pale in the lamplight. Gray or blue, she could not tell. They studied her for a long moment, taking her measure. It will not be easy, miss. I did not expect it to be. He nodded once, shortly, and turned toward the door. Clara followed him into the storm. The cold hit her like a physical blow. The wind tore at her coat and drove ice crystals against her exposed skin. She could barely see the man walking ahead of her, his broad back the only solid thing in a world gone white. 2 others had decided to brave the journey. An older man called Samuel Cork, a miner heading home to see his daughter, and a stumbling figure Clara recognized as the town doctor, clearly drunk and struggling to stay upright. The tall man in the bearskin coat did not slow for any of them. He pushed forward through the snow with the certainty of someone who had walked through worse storms than this. Clara followed. She did not know this man's name. She did not know where he was leading her. She only knew that forward was better than standing still. She had stood still for 2 years while Edmund burned her. She had waited and endured and hoped things would get better. Things had only gotten worse, never again. They walked for what felt like hours. The cold seeped through Clara's coat and dress and skin, settling into her bones like ice water. Her feet went numb. Her lungs ached with every breath of frozen air. But she kept walking. The man in the bearskin coat glanced back at her once. She thought she saw something flicker in those pale eyes. Surprise, maybe, or respect. He did not say anything, but he slowed his pace just slightly. Just enough that she could keep up without running. It was such a small thing, such a tiny kindness. But Clara felt tears prick her eyes anyway. She blinked them away before they could freeze on her cheeks and kept walking. She did not know his name was Josiah McAllister. She did not know that following him into the storm would change everything. All she knew was that the cold outside could not possibly be worse than the cold she had already survived. And so Clara Whitmore walked into the blizzard toward a town called Bitter Creek, toward a future she could not imagine. Behind her, somewhere in the darkness, a train sat motionless in the snow. And somewhere beyond that, in a fine house in Boston, a man named Edmund Cole was already searching for her. Josiah McAllister had learned to read people the way other men read books. 7 years of hunting criminals across the Western Territories had taught him that. 7 years of tracking dangerous men through wilderness and city alike. 7 years of knowing that one wrong judgment could mean a bullet in the back. He had killed 14 men in those 7 years. All of them wanted criminals. All of them deserving. All except one. But he did not think about that anymore. He did not think about much of anything anymore. Thinking led to remembering, and remembering led to places he could not afford to go. So instead, he walked through the blizzard and watched the woman following him. She was running from something. That much was obvious. The stolen clothes that did not fit. The way her eyes never stopped moving, always checking, always afraid. The bruises on her neck that she thought her collar hid, but he had seen anyway. Someone had put their hands on this woman. Someone had hurt her badly enough that she would walk through a Montana blizzard rather than sit still for 3 days. Joe knew the signs. He had seen them before. He had seen them in Sarah. The thought of his sister hit him like a fist to the gut. 3 years, and the pain had not dulled. 3 years, and he still woke sometimes reaching for his gun, ready to ride, ready to finally find Calvin Reed and make him pay for what he had done. But Calvin Reed had vanished like smoke. Joe had tracked him for 18 months across 3 territories. He had followed every lead, bribed every informant, questioned every witness. The trail had gone cold at the Mexican border and never warmed again. Calvin Reed was gone. Sarah was still dead. And Joe was left with nothing but a ranch he did not care about, and a life that felt like wearing a dead man's clothes. That was why he had placed the advertisement. Not for love, not for companionship, just because he was tired. Tired of the empty house, tired of cooking for one, tired of the silence that seemed louder than any gunshot. He had expected a farm widow looking for stability, or perhaps a plain-faced spinster seeking any husband at all. He had not expected this. A young woman with hunted eyes and hidden wounds, following him through a killing storm without complaint. The old miner, Samuel Cork, was keeping pace well enough. The man was tough as rawhide despite his years. But Doc Brennan was struggling. Joe could hear him stumbling behind them, drunk and graceless. If the man fell, Joe would have to carry him, would have to slow them all down. He hoped it would not come to that. The supply station emerged from the swirling white like a ghost taking form. Just a rough wooden structure where the railroad kept emergency supplies and fresh horses for the mail route. Joe had left his 2 horses in the small attached stable. "Get inside," he called over the wind. "I will bring the horses around." The woman did not argue. She helped Samuel Cork through the door, then turned back and grabbed Doc Brennan's arm to guide him inside as well. A practical woman, Joe noted, not one to stand around waiting for someone else to do the work. He liked that. The horses were cold and irritable, but they were alive and strong. Joe led them out and around to the station's front door, just as a sound cut through the blizzard. Wolf howl. Close. Joe's hand dropped to his gun. He scanned the darkness, but saw nothing. Wolves did not usually attack humans. They were cautious creatures who preferred easier prey. But this was a hard winter. Game was scarce, and 6 wolves against 4 humans and 2 horses might look like decent odds to a hungry pack. He pulled open the station door. "We need to move. Now!" The woman was already on her feet. Her eyes met his, and he saw no fear there, only a cold assessment of the situation and a readiness to act. "Wolves?" she asked. "Close. I heard them." She nodded once and turned to help the others. Samuel Cork was already moving, but Doc Brennan had slumped against the wall, muttering to himself. "Leave him," Samuel said. "He will only slow us down. We are not leaving anyone." That was the woman. Her voice was firm. She hooked Doc Brennan's arm over her shoulders and hauled him upright with strength that surprised Joe. "I can manage him," she said. "Just go." They went. The wolves found them halfway to town. Joe spotted them first. 6 shadows moving through the blizzard, circling the small group with patient hunger. Their eyes caught the faint light and gleamed like copper coins. "Stop," Joe said quietly. "Nobody run." The woman stopped immediately. Samuel Cork froze beside her. Doc Brennan slumped between them, too drunk to understand the danger. Joe drew his gun with one hand and pulled a knife with the other. The wolves watched him. They were assessing the threat, calculating their chances. Joe had killed men more dangerous than any wolf pack. He had faced down outlaws and murderers, and once a man who had scalped 7 people for bounty money. He was not afraid of wolves. But he only had 6 bullets, and there were 6 wolves, and if they all charged at once, someone was going to get hurt. "We need fire," he said. "Branches. Anything that will burn. I will get them." That was the woman again. She lowered Doc Brennan carefully to the ground and moved toward a stand of scrub pine nearby. Joe expected her to run, expected the wolves to go for her the moment she separated from the group. He shifted his weight, ready to shoot. But the woman did not run. She moved slowly and deliberately, never turning her back on the circling predators. She gathered an armful of dead branches and returned to the group, calm as Sunday morning. Then Joe saw the knife in her hand. A small blade, barely 4 inches, but she held it like she knew what to do with it. "You know how to use that?" he asked. "My father was a blacksmith. He taught me." Joe filed that away for later. For now, he focused on the wolves. Samuel Cork had managed to light one of the branches. The flame caught and spread, casting flickering orange light across the snow. The wolves drew back slightly, eyes narrowing. "More," Joe said. "Get them all burning." They worked quickly, building a rough ring of fire around themselves. The wolves circled, but did not attack. The flames seemed to confuse them, disrupt whatever hunting instinct had drawn them here. After what felt like an hour but was probably only minutes, the pack leader turned and vanished into the blizzard. The others followed. Joe let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. "They will not be back tonight," he said, "but we should keep moving." The woman nodded. She sheathed her knife and helped Doc Brennan to his feet again without being asked. Joe watched her. "Who are you?" he wondered. "What made you this way?" But he did not ask. He had promised no questions about the past. That was the deal he had offered in his advertisement. He meant to keep it. They found shelter in an abandoned miner's cabin a mile from town. The structure was rough but solid, with a working stove and enough firewood to last the night. Joe got a fire going while the woman settled Doc Brennan in a corner, and Samuel Cork stretched out near the warmth. Within an hour, both men were asleep. Doc Brennan's snores rattled the cabin walls. Joe sat across the fire from the woman. She had not spoken since the wolf encounter. She sat with her back against the wall, eyes on the door, hands folded in her lap. Exactly the way Sarah used to sit. "You handled yourself well out there," Joe said finally, "with the wolves." The woman looked at him. Her eyes were dark in the firelight. "I did what needed to be done. Most people panic. You did not. Panic does not help. Joe nodded. That was true enough. They sat in silence for a while. The fire crackled and popped. Outside, the blizzard still howled, but it seemed distant now, a problem for later. "What brings you to Bitter Creek?" Joe asked. The woman's expression did not change. "I am meeting the man I am supposed to marry." "Who?" "Someone who posted an advertisement for a wife. Name of McAllister." Joe felt something twist in his chest. He kept his face still. "I am McAllister," he said. The woman's eyes widened slightly. Then she laughed, a short surprise sound that held no humor. "Of course you are." They looked at each other across the fire, strangers who had answered each other's desperation, two people running from different demons who had somehow ended up in the same place. "I expected someone older," the woman said finally. "I expected someone who was not carrying a knife in her boot." She almost smiled at that. Almost. Joe studied her, the short hair, the stolen clothes, the bruises she thought she was hiding, the way she held herself like something wounded but not broken. She was running from something. Something bad enough to send her halfway across the country to marry a stranger. Joe understood that kind of running. He had done enough of it himself. "My name is Clara," the woman said. "Clara Whitmore. Joe McAllister." She nodded. "I know." The fire settled lower. Outside, the wolves had gone silent. The only sound was Doc Brennan's snoring and the endless moan of the wind. "Get some sleep," Joe said. "We will reach Bitter Creek tomorrow." Clara nodded, but she did not close her eyes. She sat with her back against the wall and her eyes on the door, watching, waiting. Joe understood that too. He did not sleep either. He sat across the fire from the woman who would be his wife and wondered what she was running from. He wondered if it would follow her here. He had a feeling it would. Bitter Creek revealed itself in the pale light of morning. Clara stood at the edge of town and looked at what would become her home. A single muddy street stretched between rough wooden buildings. A saloon with a crooked sign. A general store with barrels stacked outside. A small church with a plain white steeple. A sheriff's office with bars on the windows. Maybe 200 souls lived here by Clara's count. Maybe less. The buildings hunched low against the wind, windows small to hold in heat. Everyone she saw wore heavy furs and moved with the careful economy of people who knew winter could kill them. This was not Boston. This was not anywhere Clara had ever imagined living. It was perfect. Here she could disappear. Here she could become someone new. Here Edmund Cole and his money and his connections would mean nothing. Joe had led them through the final miles of the storm without incident. Now he stood beside her, his bearskin coat dusted with snow, his pale eyes scanning the street with the same watchfulness Clara had come to recognize. "That is Ruth Blackwood's boarding house," he said, pointing to a 2-story building at the end of the street. "Best food in town. Ruth will give you a room until we figure out what comes next." Clara looked at him. "Figure out what comes next?" "I am not going to force you into anything." Joe's voice was flat, matter-of-fact. "You came here to get away from something. I can see that plain enough. But that does not mean you have to marry me. Stay at Ruth's for a couple weeks. Get to know the place. Then decide." Clara did not know what to say. She had expected demands, expected conditions, expected to trade one cage for another. She had not expected to be given a choice. "Why?" she asked. "Why what? Why are you doing this? Any man who placed that advertisement could have demanded whatever he wanted from me. You are giving me options." Joe was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was low. "Because someone should have given my sister options. And nobody did." Clara did not ask what he meant. She understood that some wounds were not ready to be spoken about. "Thank you," she said instead. Joe nodded once and led her toward the boarding house. Ruth Blackwood was a tall woman with iron-gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She looked Clara up and down the moment they walked through the door and seemed to understand everything immediately. Joe's mail-order bride, Ruth said. It was not a question. Get inside, child. You look ready to collapse. Ruth gave Clara a room on the second floor, small but clean, with a real bed and a wash basin, and a window that looked out over the main street. She brought Clara hot food and warm blankets, and did not ask a single question about where she had come from or why. You need anything, you come find me, Ruth said. Day or night. I do not sleep much anyway. Thank you. Ruth paused at the door. Whatever you are running from, you are safe here. This is not some fancy eastern city where men think they can do whatever they want. Out here we shoot back. Clara almost smiled. Almost. After Ruth left, Clara stripped off her stolen coat and sat on the edge of the bed. Her whole body ached. Her feet throbbed from the cold. But she was here. She was alive. She was free, for now. She looked down at her hands. The calluses from her father's forge had never fully faded, even after 2 years of being Edmund Cole's ornamental wife. He had hated those calluses. Hated that they marked her as something other than the perfect society woman he wanted to display. Pain teaches obedience, Clara. His voice in her head. Always his voice. She pulled up her sleeve and looked at the scars. Dozens of small, circular burns, arranged in neat rows from wrist to elbow. Each one a lesson. Each one a reminder of what happened when she displeased him. The first time she had screamed. The second time she had begged. By the 10th time, she had learned to stay silent. Silence was survival. But silence had not been enough. No amount of obedience had been enough. Edmund Cole did not want a wife. He wanted property. He wanted something he could break and break again. Clara pulled her sleeve back down and stood. She went to the small mirror hanging on the wall and looked at herself. The bruises on her neck had faded to yellow. The cut on her lip had healed. She looked almost normal. She did not feel normal. But she was learning that feeling normal was not the same as surviving. And right now, surviving was enough. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of new faces and new routines. Clara met the other residents of Bitter Creek. Doc Brennan, who apologized sheepishly for his drunkenness during the blizzard, and offered her a free medical examination that she refused too quickly. Sheriff Morrison, a grizzled man with kind eyes who tipped his hat whenever he saw her. Martha Jenkins, the wife of the general store owner, who asked too many questions about Clara's past that Clara deflected with vague answers. She met Joe McAllister's ranch, too. It sat 3 miles outside of town, nestled in a valley where the mountains blocked the worst of the wind. A 2-story log house that Joe had built with his own hands. A large barn. About 150 head of cattle grazing in the snow-covered fields. It was not fancy. It was not Boston. But there was something solid about it, something real. If you agree, the main bedroom is yours, Joe said as they stood on the porch. I will sleep in the smaller room until we know each other better. You do not expect anything? Joe met her eyes. His gaze was direct and calm. I expect you to work hard and be honest. The rest is your choice. No one has the right to expect anything from your body except you. Clara felt something crack inside her chest. Something that had been frozen for 2 years. She did not cry. She would not let herself cry. But she came closer than she had in a very long time. She noticed one door inside the house that was padlocked shut. When she asked about it, Joe's face went blank. The past, he said. Some things are better left locked away. Clara understood that better than he knew. She agreed to stay at the ranch, to try this life at least for a while. Ruth helped her pack her few belongings and move them to the log house in the valley. You are making a good choice, Ruth said. Joe McAllister is a hard man, but he is a fair one. He will not hurt you. Clara wanted to believe that. But Edmund had seemed kind, too, at first. Everyone seemed kind until they no longer needed to pretend. Still, she had to trust someone eventually. She could not run forever. So she unpacked her stolen clothes in the room that would be hers and looked out the window at the Montana mountains and told herself that maybe, possibly, things could be different here. 3 days after moving to the ranch, Clara walked into town to buy supplies at the general store. The man named Bill Tucker was waiting for her. He was drunk, even though it was barely noon. A cowhand from one of the ranches south of town, Clara had learned. A man with a mean streak and a mouth that never stopped. "Well now," Bill said, blocking her path outside the saloon, "look who it is. The mail-order bride herself." Clara stopped. Her heart began to pound. "Excuse me," she said. "I need to get by." "What's the hurry, darling?" Bill's smile showed yellow teeth. "I just want to get acquainted. Here you came all the way from Boston. Must be lonely out at that ranch with just McAllister for company. Please move." "Or what?" Bill stepped closer. His breath smelled like whiskey. "You gonna make me?" Clara froze. Every instinct screamed at her to submit, to stay quiet, to not provoke. That was how she had survived Edmund. That was how she had stayed alive. But this was not Boston. This was not Edmund's house. "I said move." Her voice came out stronger than she expected. Bill blinked, surprised. "Got some fire in you, huh?" He reached for her arm. "I like that in a woman. You touch her and I will blow a hole in you big enough to see daylight through." Ruth Blackwood's voice cut through the street like a whip crack. Clara turned and saw the older woman standing in the doorway of the general store, a shotgun leveled at Bill Tucker's chest. "Now get," Ruth said, "before I decide you are not worth the bullet." Bill Tucker backed away, hands raised, cursing under his breath. He stumbled back into the saloon and slammed the door behind him. Ruth lowered the shotgun. "You all right, child?" "Yes." Clara's heart was still pounding. "Thank you." "You will learn," Ruth said. "This is not some eastern city. Out here we shoot back." Clara looked at the shotgun in Ruth's hands, looked at the closed saloon door. "Will you teach me?" Ruth smiled. "Now you are thinking like a Montana woman. Come on inside. I have got coffee on the stove." That evening, Clara stood in her room at the ranch and peeled off her dress. The mirror reflected what she always saw, the scars, dozens of them, running from her wrists to her elbows, scattered across her back. One large burn on her shoulder blade where Edmund had held the cigar longer than usual because she had cried. She traced one of the marks with her finger. The skin was smooth and shiny, healed but never whole. These scars were her past. They were what Edmund had done to her. They were the reason she had run. But they were also proof that she had survived. Proof that Edmund Cole had tried to break her and failed. She pulled her sleeve back down. Tomorrow she would learn to shoot. Tomorrow she would become someone who could defend herself. Tomorrow she would take another step away from the woman who had cowered in Edmund's cellar and toward whoever she was going to become. Joe McAllister seemed different. He seemed kind. He seemed safe. But Edmund had seemed those things too, once. Clara would not make the same mistake twice. She would not let anyone close enough to hurt her again. She blew out the lamp and lay in the darkness, listening to the wind outside. Somewhere in Boston, Edmund Cole was searching for her. She knew that as surely as she knew her own name. And when he found her, she would be ready. Winter settled over the ranch like a heavy blanket. Joe watched Clara adapt to this hard life faster than he had expected. She learned to split firewood within a week, her strokes growing stronger and more confident each day. She did not flinch when he slaughtered chickens for meat, instead stepping in to help pluck and clean the birds. She learned the names of all his horses and memorized where he kept every tool in the barn. She was not a fragile Boston society woman playing at frontier life. She was something else entirely. But there were things she would not do, things that told him more about her than any confession could. She never let him approach her suddenly. If he entered a room where she was working, he learned to make noise first, to call her name or clear his throat. Otherwise, she would flinch and reach for whatever was closest to hand, a knife or a poker or once a frying pan. She always wore long sleeves, even indoors, even when the fire made the cabin warm enough to cook eggs on the floor. She never rolled them up, never exposed her arms for any reason. She always sat near the exits. At meals, she chose the chair closest to the back door. When they talked in the evenings, she positioned herself near a window she could open if needed. Joe recognized these signs. He had seen them before. He had seen them in Sarah. The memory of his sister rose up unbidden, sharp and painful as a knife between the ribs. 3 years since she had died, and the wound had never healed, never even scarred over. Sarah had been 19 when she married Calvin Reed, 19 years old and so full of hope. She had written Joe letters for the first few months, happy letters about her new husband and their little farm and the baby she hoped they would have someday. Then the letters had stopped. Joe had been in Arizona territory when the telegram came. Sarah dead. Cause of death listed as an accident. He had ridden 300 miles in 4 days to get home. By the time he arrived, Sarah was already buried. The neighbors told him the truth. Calvin Reed had beaten her to death because she had spilled soup on the table. Then he had fled into the night and vanished. Joe had spent 18 months hunting that man, tracked him across 3 territories, following every lead, chasing every rumor. The trail had gone cold at the Mexican border and never warmed again. He had stopped searching not because he gave up. He had stopped because of what he was becoming. The last man Joe had questioned was a bartender in El Paso who might have seen Calvin passing through. The bartender had claimed ignorance. Joe had beaten him until the man's face was unrecognizable. The bartender had known nothing. Joe had beaten him anyway. That was when Joe understood. He was not hunting Calvin Reed anymore. He was becoming something else, something that wanted to hurt people, something that enjoyed it. So he had walked away, bought the ranch in Bitter Creek, placed an advertisement for a wife, tried to build a life that did not involve blood and violence and the screaming need for revenge that lived in his chest like a second heartbeat. Most days he could pretend it worked. Most days. Tonight was not one of those days. Joe stood at the window of his small bedroom, looking out at the snow falling in the darkness. Clara was asleep in the main bedroom down the hall, safe, warm, alive. Sarah had deserved that too. Sarah had deserved warmth and safety, and a husband who would protect her instead of destroy her. Calvin Reed had taken all of that away, and Joe had failed to make him pay. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass and tried to breathe through the rage that never fully subsided. Someday, he promised himself, someday he would find Calvin Reed. And on that day, no one would stop him from doing what needed to be done. The wolves attacked 3 weeks after Clara arrived. Joe heard the cattle screaming in the pre-dawn darkness and was out of bed with his rifle before he was fully awake. He ran to the window and saw dark shapes moving among the herd, quick and lethal. Clara appeared in his doorway, dressed and alert. Wolves? Yes. Stay here. He ran out into the cold without his coat, firing at the shapes among the cattle. The wolves scattered, but not before they had killed 3 of his best breeding stock and wounded 2 more. By the time the sun rose, Joe had counted the damage. 3 dead, 5 missing, scattered into the hills by the attack. He needed to track them down before they froze or the wolves found them again. The problem was his leg. He had stepped in an old trap hidden under the snow while running to defend the herd. The rusted jaws had closed on his calf, tearing through his pants and deep into the muscle. Doc Brennan had stitched it up but warned him to stay off it for at least a week. Joe did not have a week. Those cattle would be dead by then. I will help you find them. He looked up to see Clara standing in the barn doorway, dressed for riding. No, he said. It is dangerous out there. More dangerous for 1 person than 2. I can handle it. Can you? Clara's voice was calm but firm. You can barely walk. You need someone to help you track and someone to cover you if those wolves come back. I can ride. I can shoot. Ruth has been teaching me. Joe stared at her. He wanted to argue. He wanted to tell her to stay safe in the house where nothing could hurt her. But she was right. He could not do this alone. And maybe, he realized, that was not entirely a bad thing. All right, he said finally. Saddle up. We leave in 10 minutes. They rode out into the white morning, following the scattered tracks of the fleeing cattle. Clara proved to be a skilled rider. handling her horse with easy confidence despite the treacherous footing. She spotted the first set of tracks before Joe did. "There," she said, pointing. "3 went toward the creek, 2 went up the ridge." "How do you know?" "The tracks. See how these are deeper on one side? Those are the older cow and her calf. The others are from the yearlings." Joe looked at her with new respect. "Your father teach you that too?" "No." Clara's expression flickered. "I learned it from books. Edmund had a library. I read everything in it while he was away on business trips. It was the only freedom I had." Edmund. The name landed between them like a stone dropped in still water. "Your husband," Joe said carefully. Clara was silent for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Yes, my husband." She urged her horse forward. "We should keep moving." They tracked the cattle through the morning and into the afternoon. The animals had scattered farther than Joe expected, driven by terror into the high country where the snow was deep and the wolves would have easy hunting. They found the first 3 near a frozen creek, huddled together for warmth. Joe roped them and Clara helped drive them back toward the lower slopes where the snow was not as deep. The other 2 were higher up, near a narrow pass that led into the mountains. "Storm coming," Joe said, looking at the sky. "We will not make it back before it hits." Clara followed his gaze. The clouds were building on the western horizon, dark and heavy with snow. "Is there shelter?" "There is a cave system about a mile ahead. We can wait out the worst of it there." They pushed on, driving the remaining cattle before them. The storm caught them just as they reached the cave, a shallow overhang of rock that provided protection from the wind and snow. Joe built a fire while Clara secured the horses and cattle. They worked together without speaking, each knowing what needed to be done. When the fire was burning steadily and the storm was howling outside, they sat together in the flickering light and waited. "Thank you," Joe said finally, "for helping today." Clara looked at him. Her face was shadowed, unreadable. "You would have done the same. Maybe. But that does not make it less worthy of thanks." They were quiet for a while. The fire crackled and popped. Outside, the storm seemed to be building, the wind screaming through the rocks like something alive. "Can I ask you something?" Clara's voice was soft. Joe nodded. "You said your sister died, and that her husband killed her." Joe's hands tightened. "Yes." "What was her name?" "Sarah. Sarah McAllister." "How long ago?" 3 years. Clara was quiet for a moment. "Did they catch him? The husband?" "No." Joe's voice went flat. "He ran, changed his name, disappeared. I spent 18 months hunting him. Never found him. I am sorry." Joe looked at her. Her eyes were wet in the firelight. "You know something about that kind of pain," he said. It was not a question. Clara did not answer. Instead, she looked away into the flames. After a while, exhaustion claimed them both. Joe sat with his back against the cave wall, rifle across his lap, watching the storm. Clara dozed beside him, her head gradually falling until it rested against his shoulder. He did not move her, did not wake her, just sat there in the darkness and the cold, feeling her warmth against his side. For the first time in 3 years, he felt something other than rage and emptiness. He did not know what to call it yet, but it felt like the beginning of something. The storm passed overnight. They drove the cattle home the next morning, arriving at the ranch as the sun climbed above the mountains. Clara helped him stable the horses and check on the rest of the herd. She moved easily now, comfortably, like someone who belonged here. "There is something I have not told you," Joe said as they walked back toward the house. Clara stopped. Her expression went guarded. "I have a box of Sarah's things," Joe continued. "Things the neighbors saved after she died. I never opened it. Could not bring myself to look." Clara's expression softened. "That is understandable. Maybe someday I will be ready. Maybe if I had someone to sit with me when I do." Clara was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded. "When you are ready," she said, "I will be there." It was not a promise, but it was something close. They walked into the house together as the Montana sun rose higher and the snow began to melt. The Chinook wind came in late February. Clara had heard about these warm spells from Ruth, who called them snow eaters, hot winds that blew down from the mountains and melted the snow almost overnight. Dangerous in their own way because they made the creeks flood and turned the roads to impassable mud. But after months of bone-deep cold, the warmth was welcome. Clara was alone in the kitchen when it happened. Joe had ridden out early to check the far pastures, not expecting to return until afternoon. She had taken advantage of his absence to do laundry, heating water on the stove and scrubbing clothes in the big metal tub. The house was warm, warmer than it had been in months. Clara had started the day in her usual long-sleeved dress, but as the sun climbed and the Chinook winds pushed the temperature higher, she found herself unbearably hot. No one was here. Joe would not be back for hours. She rolled up her sleeves. The scars caught the light from the window as she worked. Dozens of small circles, perfectly round, marching up her arms like brands on cattle. Some were white and shiny with age. Others were still pink, not yet fully healed. Clara tried not to look at them. She focused on the laundry, on the rhythm of scrubbing, on the warmth of the water. She reached for a pot on a high shelf, stretched too far, lost her balance. The kitchen door opened. Joe. He was early. His horse had thrown a shoe and he had turned back. He walked in just as Clara stumbled, reaching out instinctively to catch her. His hand closed around her arm, and then he saw. Clara watched his face change, watched the confusion give way to understanding, watched understanding give way to something else entirely. His hand was still on her arm, still supporting her. His eyes traced the line of scars from her wrist to her elbow. She saw his jaw tighten, saw his breathing change. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, not the quiet of calm or peace, the quiet of a blade being drawn. "Who did this?" Clara yanked her arm back. "No one. It is nothing. That is not nothing." Joe's voice stayed quiet, dangerously quiet, each word precise and cold. "Those are burns, deliberate burns, dozens of them. Please." Clara backed away. Her heart was hammering. Old instincts screamed at her to run, to hide, to make herself small. "You do not want me anymore. I understand. I will leave." "No." The word cracked through the kitchen like a gunshot. Clara flinched. Joe took a breath. When he spoke again, his voice was controlled, but she could hear what it cost him. "You are not going anywhere. Sit down. Breathe." Clara sank into a chair. Her whole body was shaking now. This was it. This was the moment everything fell apart. He had seen. He knew. He would throw her out or hit her or do whatever men did when they discovered their wives were damaged goods. Joe did not throw her out. He did not hit her. He knelt in front of her chair. "Look at me," he said. Clara could not raise her eyes. "Clara, look at me." She forced herself to meet his gaze. His eyes were pale as ice, cold but not cruel. There was something burning in them, something fierce, but it was not directed at her. "Tell me who did this," he said. "Tell me so I know who deserves to die." Clara felt tears slip down her cheeks. She had not cried in front of anyone for 2 years. She had learned not to. Tears only made Edmund angrier, but she was not with Edmund anymore. "His name is Edmund Cole," she said. "My husband. In Boston." She told him everything. The words came out slowly at first, then faster, a flood she could not stop. She told him about her father dying, about her mother remarrying, about Edmund charming everyone with his wealth and fine manners, about the wedding night when he had first put his hands around her throat. She told him about the lessons. He said pain teaches obedience. Clara's voice was hollow. He would light a cigar and watch the tip glow. Then he would hold it against my skin until I screamed. He called them lessons. Joe did not interrupt. He did not look away. His face was stone, but his eyes burned. "I tried to be good," Clara continued. "I tried to do everything right, but it was never enough. Nothing was ever enough. He always found something to punish. She told him about the cellar, the days locked in darkness when she displeased him particularly badly, the cold and the hunger and the fear. She told him about the night she had finally run, Edmund drunk and angry, his hands around her throat, squeezing until her vision went black. She had grabbed a fireplace poker and hit him, had not stopped to see if he was alive or dead, had just run. "He will come for me," Clara said. "I know he will. He said I was his property, that no one leaves Edmund Cole. He will find me and he will kill me." Joe was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke, and his voice was still that cold, quiet blade. "He will not touch you again, never. If he comes here, he will have to kill me first." "You do not understand." Clara shook her head. "He is rich. He has connections. He can hire whoever he wants to find me. I have killed 14 men. Clara stared at him. Joe's expression did not change. "All of them wanted criminals. I was a bounty hunter for 7 years. I tracked men across 3 territories and brought them back for justice. Sometimes alive, sometimes not." He leaned forward slightly. "I know how to find people, Clara, and I know how to stop them. Edmund Cole is nothing I have not faced before." Clara did not know what to say. She had expected disgust, expected rejection, expected to be thrown out into the cold. She had not expected this. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you protect me?" Joe stood. He walked to the door and stopped without turning around. "My sister was beaten to death by her husband. I arrived one day too late." His voice cracked just slightly. "I will not be late again." He walked out into the Chinook wind and left Clara alone in the kitchen with her tears and her scars, and a strange new feeling she could not name. It felt like hope. That evening, Joe did not ask any more questions. He cooked dinner while Clara sat by the fire, too exhausted from the emotional storm to do anything else. He brought her food and sat across from her, and they ate in silence. But it was not an uncomfortable silence, not the silence of strangers or enemies. It was the silence of 2 people who understood each other's pain. After dinner, Joe spoke again. "I want to teach you to shoot properly. Not just how Ruth has been showing you. I want you to know how to defend yourself if the need arises." Clara looked at him. "All right. And I want you to know that whatever you decide, whether to stay here or go somewhere else, I will help you. You are not trapped here. You have choices." The word hit Clara like a physical blow. Choices. She had not had choices in years. "I want to stay," she said. "For now, at least. If you will have me, I will have you." They sat by the fire until the lamps burned low. Clara could not sleep, her mind too full of everything that had happened. But for the first time in 2 years, she felt something other than fear. She felt safe, not completely, not yet. Edmund Cole was still out there, still hunting her, still wanting what he believed was his property. But she was not alone anymore, and that made all the difference. 2 weeks passed. Clara learned to shoot. Not just the basics that Ruth had taught her. Joe showed her how to clean and maintain a weapon, how to reload quickly under pressure, how to aim for the center of mass because that was easiest to hit in a crisis, how to squeeze the trigger rather than pull it. She practiced every day until her arms ached and her ears rang, until she could hit a target at 50 yards more often than not, until holding a gun felt as natural as holding a fork. "You have a gift for this," Joe said one afternoon, as Clara put 6 bullets into a row of tin cans. "Better aim than most men I have known." Clara lowered the rifle. "My father used to say I had steady hands, good for metal work, good for staying alive too." She looked at him. The afternoon sun was behind him, turning his hair to copper and throwing his face into shadow. Something had changed between them since the day he saw her scars. They talked more easily now, laughed occasionally. Joe told her stories about his years as a bounty hunter, careful to avoid the darkest parts. Clara told him about her childhood, about her father's forge, about the books she had read in Edmund's library while dreaming of escape. They were becoming something. Clara did not know what to call it yet, but she was starting to hope it might be good. "There is something I need to do," Joe said that evening after dinner. "Something I have put off for 3 years." Clara waited. "Sarah's belongings. I need to go through them. I need to know if there is anything that might help me find Calvin Reed." The name hung in the air between them. Joe had told her about Calvin Reed, about Sarah's murder, about the 18 months he had spent hunting a ghost. "Do you want company?" Joe looked at her. "Yes, I think I do." The box was in the locked room upstairs. Joe had shown Clara the room a few days earlier, explaining what it contained. His sister's belongings, his research on Calvin Reed, maps and letters and dead ends. He unlocked the door and they went in together. The box was small, barely larger than a shoebox. Joe lifted the lid with hands that trembled slightly. Inside were the remnants of a life cut short. A few letters in a young woman's handwriting. A pressed flower, brown and crumbling. A ribbon that might have been blue once. A simple gold wedding ring. And at the bottom, a small leather-bound book. "Her diary," Joe said. His voice was rough. "I did not know she kept one. Do you want to read it?" Joe picked up the diary, then set it down again. "I cannot. Not yet." Clara reached out and picked up the book. "What if I read it for you? I could tell you only what seems important." Joe looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Thank you." Clara would not read the diary until days later, but she took it to her room that night and held it in her hands, thinking about the young woman who had written in it. The young woman who had died because she married the wrong man. Clara understood that kind of mistake. She had made it herself. But Sarah had not escaped. Sarah had not had a train to Montana or a stranger named McAllister to take her in. Sarah had died. Clara held the diary to her chest and made a silent promise. She would not die the same way. 3 days later, Ruth rode out to the ranch with news. "Someone is asking about you," Ruth said without preamble. "A friend in Omaha sent word. A man has been making inquiries about a young woman who left Boston recently. Brown hair, early 20s, might be using a different name." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "Edmund." Ruth nodded. "Sounds like he has not given up looking. And if he is asking in Omaha, it means he knows you went west." "How long do we have?" Joe asked. "Hard to say. If he sends someone by train, could be less than a week." Joe's expression went cold. The same cold Clara had seen when he found her scars. "Thank you for the warning, Ruth. We will be ready." After Ruth left, Joe began making preparations. He checked his weapons, cleaned them, loaded them, stacked extra ammunition in easy reach. He walked the property and identified defensive positions, places where someone could hide or make a stand. Clara watched him transform from rancher to hunter. "This is not the first time you have done this," she said. "No." Joe checked the action on his rifle. "But it might be the most important." That night, after dinner, Joe sat Clara down at the table. "We need to talk about what happens when they come," he said. Clara nodded. She had been expecting this. "I want you to promise me something. If things go badly, if it looks like we are going to lose, I want you to run. Take a horse and ride for the mountains. I have cached supplies in a cave about 10 miles north. You can survive there long enough for things to settle down. And leave you to die? If that is what it takes to keep you safe, yes." Clara reached across the table and took his hand. Joe looked startled by the contact. They had not touched since the day in the kitchen. "I am not running again," Clara said. "I have run twice in my life, once from my father's death, once from Edmund. I am done running." "Clara." She squeezed his hand. "If we fight together. If we die together. That is my choice. You gave me the right to make choices. This is the one I am making." Joe stared at her. Something shifted in his eyes. "All right," he said finally. "Together, then." They did not let go of each other's hands for a long time. Meanwhile, in Boston, Edmund Cole sat in his fine office and studied a report from his private investigators. Bitter Creek, Montana Territory, the lead investigator had written. Subject is living on a ranch owned by one Josiah McAllister, former bounty hunter with a reputation for violence. Edmund smiled. Clara had found herself a protector. How touching. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a cigar case. Beside it was a special ashtray, the metal still bearing faint bloodstains from the last lesson he had given Clara before she ran. He lit a cigar and watched the tip glow red. Pain teaches obedience. Clara had forgotten her lessons. She thought she could escape him. Thought she could start a new life with some frontier savage. She was wrong. No one left Edmund Cole, no one. He picked up his pen and wrote a name on a piece of paper. Victor Kane. Kane was a bounty hunter like this McAllister had been. But unlike McAllister, Kane had no moral code. Kane would do anything for the right price. Edmund was willing to pay a very high price indeed. 5 times your usual fee, he wrote in his letter to Kane. Clara Cole, formerly Clara Whitmore, currently residing in Bitter Creek, Montana. I want her brought back to me alive. If anyone attempts to stop you, kill them. He sealed the letter and summoned a servant to post it. Then he leaned back in his chair and smoked his cigar, and thought about all the lessons he would teach Clara when she was home again. She had been gone for nearly 2 months now. 2 months of freedom. 2 months of thinking she had escaped. Edmund would enjoy taking all of that away. He would enjoy it very much indeed. The letter arrived 3 days before everything changed. Clara was alone at the ranch when the mail rider came. Joe had gone to town to speak with Sheriff Morrison about security, leaving Clara with a loaded rifle and strict instructions to shoot first and ask questions later. She did not shoot the mail rider, but she was tempted. Letter for you, ma'am, the young man said, handing over an envelope. Came through the Omaha station. Clara's hands went cold. The handwriting on the envelope was familiar. Elegant loops and precise letters. The handwriting of a man who had practiced penmanship in expensive schools. Edmund. She waited until the mail rider was gone before opening it. Dearest Clara, the letter began. I know where you are. I am coming. We will speak as civilized people. If you return to me now, I will spare your cowboy. If not, you know what will happen. With love, Edmund. Clara read the letter 3 times. Each time the words felt more like a knife in her chest. He knew. He had found her. He was coming, and he was threatening to kill Joe. Her first instinct was to run, saddle a horse and ride into the mountains, lead Edmund away from the ranch, protect the man who had given her shelter. But Joe had made her promise. No more running. They would face this together. She hid the letter. It was stupid. She knew it was stupid even as she tucked the envelope under her mattress. Joe needed to know what they were facing. Joe needed to see Edmund's words for himself. But the old habits were hard to break. 2 years of hiding things from Edmund, of keeping secrets to avoid punishment, of lying to survive. Those instincts did not disappear overnight. She would tell Joe. She would. Just not yet. Just not until she figured out what to do. Joe found the letter that evening. Clara had gone outside to bring in firewood. Joe was cleaning his guns at the kitchen table when something made him look up at the ceiling, at the bedroom above. He did not know what made him search Clara's room. Instinct, maybe. The same instinct that had kept him alive through 7 years of bounty hunting. The letter was under her mattress. He read it twice. Then he put it in his pocket and went back to cleaning his guns. When Clara came back inside, he was waiting. You were going to tell me about this? Clara stopped in the doorway. The firewood fell from her arms. Joe held up the letter. I found it. I was going to tell you. When? Clara did not have an answer. Joe stood. He walked toward her slowly, the letter in his hand. You were going to go back to him. He said it quietly. To protect me. Clara's eyes filled with tears. I cannot let him hurt you because of me. That is not your choice to make. They stood facing each other across the kitchen, the weight of the letter between them. Why did you hide it? Joe asked. Why did you not tell me immediately? Because I was afraid. Clara's voice cracked. Because for 2 years I learned to hide everything from Edmund. Every thought, every feeling, every plan. Hiding became survival. I do not know how to stop. Joe looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something unexpected. He closed the distance between them and pulled her into his arms. Clara stiffened at first. Physical contact still made her flinch. But Joe held her gently, carefully, giving her time to pull away if she needed to. She did not pull away. You are not alone anymore, Joe said against her hair. You do not have to hide things from me. Even the things you think might hurt me. Clara pressed her face against his chest. I am sorry. I know. They stood there for a long time, holding each other in the kitchen while the fire crackled and the winter wind moaned outside. Then Joe stepped back. We need to talk about what comes next, he said. But first there is something you should know. What? The man who killed my sister. His name was Calvin Reed. I tracked him for 18 months before I lost the trail. Clara nodded. You told me. I never knew what he looked like. Not clearly. The neighbors had different descriptions, and the sketch I had drawn was based on conflicting accounts. But there were things I knew about him. Things Sarah had written about in her letters before she died. Joe paused. His jaw was tight. She wrote about his habits, how he would light a cigar and watch the tip glow before he burned her, how he called the burns lessons, how he said pain teaches obedience. Clara felt the world tilt beneath her feet. That is exactly what Edmund said to me, she whispered. Those exact words. I know. Joe reached into his pocket and pulled out Sarah's diary. I finally read it. Last night after you fell asleep, I read every word. He opened the diary to a marked page and handed it to Clara. She read Sarah's words in the flickering lamplight. He lights his cigarette and watches the tip glow. He says it is time for my lesson. He holds it against my skin until I scream. He calls them lessons. He says pain teaches obedience. Clara's hands shook. The same words, the exact same method, the same signature cruelty. Joe, she said. Her voice was barely a whisper. I know. Joe's face was carved from stone. Calvin Reed and Edmund Cole are the same man. The revelation hung between them like a thundercloud. 3 years ago, the man now calling himself Edmund Cole had beaten Sarah McAllister to death. He had fled Montana, changed his name, moved to Boston, and built himself a new life. Then he had married Clara, and done it all over again. He killed your sister, Clara said, and then he married me. Yes. Joe, I am so sorry. You have nothing to apologize for. Joe's voice was flat. You are a victim, just like Sarah was. But if I had known, if I had realized. How could you have realized? He changed his name, changed his location, built a whole new identity. You could not have known. Clara looked at the diary in her hands, at Sarah's words describing the same torture Clara had endured. 2 women, same monster, same cigarette burns, same lessons. What do we do now? Clara asked. Joe's eyes were cold, hard, the eyes of the bounty hunter he had been. We wait for him to come, and when he does, we end this. Clara closed the diary. She thought about Sarah, a woman she had never met. A woman who had suffered the same way Clara had suffered. A woman who had not escaped. She thought about Edmund Cole, about Calvin Reed, about the monster hiding behind 2 different names. She thought about the lessons he had taught her, the scars he had left on her body. And she thought about the rifle leaning against the wall and the skills she had developed over weeks of practice. Edmund was coming. Calvin Reed was coming. And Clara was ready. The blizzard came 3 days later. It swept down from the mountains without warning, worse than any storm Clara had seen since her arrival in Montana. Snow fell so thick she could not see the barn from the house. Wind screamed through the valleys like something in pain. "They will use the storm," Joe said, watching the white darkness outside the window. "Storm this bad, there will be no help coming from town. We are on our own." Clara checked her rifle for the 10th time. "I am ready." They had prepared as well as they could. Joe had barricaded the doors and shuttered the windows. They had stacked furniture to create defensive positions. Clara had memorized every room, every escape route, every place where she could take cover. Now they waited. The attack came at midnight. Clara heard the horses first. The sound of hooves muffled by snow but still audible over the wind. Joe had heard it too. He was already moving, rifle in hand. "How many?" Clara whispered. "Cannot tell. At least 4 horses. Maybe 5. A voice cut through the storm, loud enough to carry even over the screaming wind. "McAllister, send out the woman. The boss in Boston wants to talk to her. You are not part of this." Clara recognized that voice, not specifically, but the type. Cold, amused, the voice of a man who enjoyed causing pain. Joe positioned himself at the window. He did not raise his voice, but his words were clear. "She is not going anywhere, and you should worry about yourself." Silence. Then laughter. "Have it your way, cowboy." The first shot shattered the window. Clara ducked as glass sprayed across the room. She heard Joe returning fire, the crack of his rifle impossibly loud in the enclosed space. She crawled to her own position near the back door, heart hammering. "How many?" she called. 5, maybe 6. Joe fired again. 3 coming from the front. 2 flanking left. Clara checked the back window. Movement in the swirling snow. A shadow approaching. 1 on the right, too, she reported. She raised her rifle, sighted on the shadow, squeezed the trigger. The shadow fell. Clara stared at the place where the man had been. Her first kill. She had just taken a human life. Good shot. Joe's voice cut through her shock. "Stay focused. There are more coming." She pushed the horror aside. There would be time to process it later, if there was a later. The battle raged for what felt like hours. Clara fired and reloaded, fired and reloaded. She heard Joe's rifle cracking from the front of the house. She heard men screaming. She heard the wind howling. Then the front door exploded inward. A tall man came through the wreckage, gun in hand. His face was scarred from forehead to jaw, the mark of some old violence. He moved fast despite his size, sweeping the room with his weapon. Joe met him in the middle of the floor. They collided like 2 trains. Joe's rifle went flying. The tall man's gun discharged into the ceiling. Then they were grappling, fists and elbows and knees. 2 trained fighters trying to kill each other. Clara could not shoot without risking Joe. She watched helplessly as they crashed through the furniture, each seeking an advantage. The tall man was winning. He was bigger than Joe, stronger, fresher. He pinned Joe to the floor and wrapped his hands around Joe's throat. "You have gone soft, McAllister," the tall man said. "Living out here playing house. Pathetic." Joe's face was turning purple. His hands clawed at the man's grip but could not break it. Clara raised her rifle. "Let him go." The tall man looked up at her. He smiled, a terrible, dead smile. "What are you going to do, sweetheart? Shoot me?" "Yes." She fired. The bullet took him in the shoulder. He fell back with a scream, releasing Joe. Joe gasped for air, rolling onto his side. The tall man tried to rise. Clara shot him again, in the leg this time. He collapsed. She walked toward him, rifle steady. "Who are you?" she asked. The man looked up at her through pain-glazed eyes. "Victor Kane. Your husband sent me. He is not my husband anymore." She wanted to shoot him again. Wanted to put a bullet between his eyes and make him pay for everyone he had hurt. For the men who had come with him. For the terror of the last hour. But Joe was struggling to his feet, one hand on his bruised throat. "We need him alive," Joe rasped. "He can testify against Edmund." Clara's finger tightened on the trigger. "Clara!" She lowered the rifle. Victor Kane laughed weakly. Blood bubbled from his wounds. "Edmund Cole," he said. "Or should I say Calvin Reed?" Joe went very still. "That is right, McAllister. I know all about it. The boss talks when he drinks. Told me all about his first wife, the one he killed in Montana 3 years ago. Sarah, was it?" Clara watched Joe's face change. Watched the cold fury transform into something hotter, something dangerous. Joe moved before Clara could stop him. He grabbed Victor Kane by the throat and dragged him upright. His fist connected with Kane's face once, twice, 3 times. Blood sprayed across the floor. "Where is he?" Joe demanded. "Where is Calvin Reed?" "Boston." Kane's voice was garbled by blood. "But he is coming. When he finds out I failed, he will come himself." Joe hit him again and again. His fists rose and fell, rose and fell. Clara watched the man she had begun to love turn into something she did not recognize, a creature of pure violence, no thought, no restraint. "Joe!" He did not stop. "Joe!" She grabbed his arm. He spun toward her, fist raised. Their eyes met. Joe froze. His fist trembled in the air. His face was spattered with Kane's blood. His eyes were wild, unrecognizing. Then something shifted. The wildness faded. The man she knew came back. He looked at his bloody hands, looked at Victor Kane, barely conscious on the floor, looked at Clara. "I could not stop," he said. His voice cracked. "I wanted to kill him." "I wanted to, but you did stop." Clara reached up and touched his face. "You heard me, and you stopped." Joe pulled her into his arms. They stood there in the wreckage of their home, surrounded by blood and broken glass, holding each other. Outside, the storm was finally dying. Inside, something else was just beginning. Edmund Cole arrived in Bitter Creek 3 days after the battle. He came alone. That surprised Clara when Ruth brought the news. She had expected more hired guns, more violence. But Edmund's arrogance was greater than his caution. He had built an empire in Boston. He had escaped justice for 3 years. He believed himself untouchable. He walked into the saloon at noon and announced his presence to everyone within earshot. "I am here for my wife. Anyone who interferes will regret it." Ruth had brought Clara the news immediately. "He is waiting in the street," Ruth said, "demanding to see you." Clara looked at Joe. His bruises from the fight with Victor Kane were fading, but his eyes were still hard, the eyes of a hunter. "This ends today," Joe said. Clara nodded. Together. They walked out into the Bitter Creek Main Street side by side. Edmund stood in the frozen mud, wearing a fine coat that looked ridiculous against the rough frontier buildings. He smiled when he saw Clara, that charming smile he had used to court her mother's approval. "Clara, darling, you have caused me so much trouble." Clara stopped 10 feet from him. Joe stood beside her, hand near his gun. "I am not your darling," Clara said. "I am not your wife. I am not your property." Edmund's smile flickered. "You will always be mine, until I decide otherwise." "No." Clara stepped forward, closer to the monster who had burned her, closer to the man who had killed Joe's sister. "You taught me to fear. 2 years I lived in your hell. 2 years of your lessons." She rolled up her sleeve. The scars caught the pale winter sunlight. Dozens of circular burns, testament to his cruelty. "But you know what, Edmund, or should I call you Calvin?" His face changed. The charming mask cracked, revealing something ugly beneath. "You know," Clara continued, "I know what you did to Sarah McAllister. I know what you are. That is ancient history. That is murder." Edmund's hand moved toward his coat. Joe's gun cleared leather in the same instant. "Do not," Joe said. His voice was flat, cold. Edmund looked at Joe for the first time, really looked. "So you are the brother," Edmund said. "The one who spent 18 months hunting me. I heard about that. Heard you got close a few times, close enough to find you now. And what are you going to do? Kill me in the street?" Joe's jaw tightened. Clara could see the war playing out behind his eyes. Vengeance and justice, the desire to destroy and the need to remain human. "He killed Sarah," something in Joe screamed. "Kill him. Make him pay." But Clara was watching him. Clara, who had suffered the same way Sarah had suffered. Clara, who needed him to be better than his rage. Joe lowered his gun slightly, not holstered but no longer aimed at Edmund's heart. "No," Joe said. "I am going to watch you hang." Edmund laughed. "You think some frontier court is going to convict me? I am a respected businessman. I have lawyers. I have money. You have nothing here." Sheriff Morrison stepped out of his office, star glinting on his chest. Beside him stood Doc Brennan and Ruth Blackwood and half a dozen other townspeople. "Edmund Cole," Morrison said, "also known as Calvin Reed. You are under arrest for the murder of Sarah McAllister. You will be held in the territorial jail in Helena and tried for your crimes. This is absurd." Edmund's hand moved faster than Clara expected. A derringer appeared from inside his coat, small and deadly. Joe fired. The bullet took Edmund's hand. The derringer went flying. Edmund screamed and collapsed, clutching his bleeding wrist. Joe advanced, knife drawn. His face was terrible to see. 3 years I hunted you, 3 years I imagined this moment, how I would make you suffer. Edmund looked up at him with pain-glazed eyes. Joe raised the knife. "Joe." Clara's voice cut through his rage. He stopped. "He does not deserve a warrior's death. He deserves to rot in a cell until they hang him." Joe stood frozen, knife in hand. The choice balanced on a razor's edge. Then he stepped back. The knife disappeared into its sheath. "Sheriff." Morrison moved forward with handcuffs. "Edmund Cole, you have the right to remain silent. You will be transported to Helena to stand trial for murder." "You cannot do this!" Edmund screamed as the cuffs clicked around his wrists. "I am Edmund Cole. I am a respected man. You were Edmund Cole," Joe said. "Now you are just Calvin Reed, a murderer, and justice has finally caught up with you." Clara stepped forward. She knelt beside Edmund as Morrison hauled him to his feet. "You wanted to own me," she said quietly, so only he could hear. "You wanted to break me. Look at me now, Edmund. I am free, and you will spend whatever is left of your miserable life knowing that you failed." Edmund tried to spit at her. Missed. Clara stood, turned her back on him, and walked away without looking back. She did not need to see him anymore. She was finally, completely free. 2 months later, Clara stood at the window of the ranch house and watched the sun rise over Montana. The land stretched out before her, endless and wild. Snow still covered the higher peaks, but spring was coming. The creek ran fast with snowmelt, and the first green shoots were pushing through the mud. It was beautiful. It was harsh. It was home. Behind her, Joe stirred in the bed they now shared. "You are up early." "Could not sleep," Clara said. "Too much to think about." Joe rose and came to stand beside her. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her against his warmth. "Good thoughts or bad thoughts?" "Good ones. Mostly." The trial had ended a week ago. Calvin Reed, formerly known as Edmund Cole, had been found guilty of the murder of Sarah McAllister. The evidence was overwhelming. Testimony from Sarah's old neighbors, Joe's research files, Victor Kane's confession, traded for a lighter sentence at the territorial prison, Clara's own testimony about the identical methods of abuse. The jury had deliberated for less than an hour. Guilty. Death by hanging. Joe had traveled to Helena for the execution. Clara had stayed home. She did not need to see Edmund die. She had already won her victory the day she walked away from him in the street. Joe had told her about it afterward, about Edmund's final words, about the moment the trapdoor opened. "He said we were the same," Joe had said. "Killers both." "What did you tell him?" "That he killed innocents? I killed men like him. We are nothing alike." On the way back from Helena, Joe had stopped at Sarah's grave. He had placed wildflowers on the headstone and spoken to his sister for the first time in 3 years. "It is done, Sarah. He cannot hurt anyone anymore. And I found someone. Someone who understands. I think you would like her. Clara pressed back against Joe's chest, feeling his heartbeat steady and strong. I have something for you, she said. She turned in his arms and pulled a small object from her pocket. Edmund's wedding ring. She had kept it all this time, hidden in her belongings, a reminder of what she had escaped, a chain she had not been ready to break. I held on to this because I was not ready to let go, she said. But I'm ready now. She walked to the fireplace where the morning fire was burning low. She looked at the gold band in her palm one last time. Then she threw it into the flames. The gold caught the light as it fell, glinted once, then disappeared into the coals. Clara felt something release inside her chest, the last chain breaking, the last link to her old life dissolving into ash. Joe came up behind her and took her hand. "Marry me," he said. Clara turned to look at him. "I do not know what kind of husband I will be," Joe continued. "Life out here is hard. I have a past soaked in blood. I am not a good man." He paused. "But I love you. And I want to spend whatever years I have left proving that you deserve to be loved, not hurt." Clara reached up and touched his face. The same face that had frightened her when she first saw it, hard and cold and closed. The same face that had softened over months of shared work and shared pain. "You do not have to prove anything," she said. "You gave me something I thought I would never have again, the right to choose." She smiled. "And I choose you." They were married in the small Bitter Creek church 3 weeks later. The ceremony was simple. Ruth Blackwood served as witness. Doc Brennan attended, 8 months sober now and steady as a rock. Sheriff Morrison sat in the front pew with his wife. A handful of neighbors filled the rest of the seats. Clara wore a blue dress that Ruth had helped her make. Joe wore his one good suit. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Joe kissed her with such tenderness that Clara felt tears slip down her cheeks. That night, in the bedroom they would share for the rest of their lives, Clara undressed before her husband. She did not hide her scars, did not cover her arms or turn away. She let him see everything, every mark Edmund had left on her body. Joe looked at her in the lamplight, and then he kissed each scar, slowly, reverently, as if they were something precious. "These do not make you ugly," he said. "They make you a survivor." Clara cried then, not from sadness, but from being truly seen for the first time in her life. The next morning, Clara woke first. She slipped out of bed and went to the window. The sun was rising over the mountains, painting the sky gold and pink. Joe came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" Clara leaned back against him. "I am thinking about the woman who stepped off that train, the one who was so scared she could barely breathe, the one who thought she would never be safe again." "What about her?" "She is gone." Clara turned in his arms. "I came here looking for somewhere to hide. Instead, I found home." Joe smiled, that rare, real smile she had learned to treasure. "Welcome home," he said. Outside, Montana stretched endless and wild, harsh and unforgiving and utterly free. Clara McAllister stood with her husband's arms around her, watching the sun rise on her new life. She had arrived in Bitter Creek with nothing but scars and fear. She had found love and justice and a place where she belonged. She had found home. And that, Clara thought as the morning light grew stronger, was worth every mile of the journey that brought her here. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.